The smell of lilies almost made me sick. That's the first thing I remember about that afternoon. The funeral home had pumped the air full of them, and my stepmother had insisted on the white ones because she said the pink ones looked cheap. Grandma Rosalind would have hated white lilies. She liked sunflowers, the messy kind with bees still crawling on them, the kind she grew along the chain-link fence behind her bungalow in Asheville. I was standing by the casket when my stepmother walked past me without looking. She had on the black Chanel knockoff she'd bought for my father's wedding 3 years ago, and she smelled like Estee Lauder beautiful and resentment. Behind her came my stepbrother Tobias, his tie crooked, his eyes already scanning the room for who mattered and who didn't. I was 31 years old, and I had stopped mattering to either of them around the time I turned 12. "You'll need to clear out her place by Sunday," my stepmother said over her shoulder, not stopping. "The realtor is doing the staging Monday morning." I didn't answer. I had learned a long time ago that answering her was like pulling on a thread. The whole sweater came apart, and you were the one left holding the yarn. After the service, my father pulled me aside by the coffee station. He looked tired, which is the same way he had looked for 10 years, ever since my mother died, and he'd married my stepmother 6 months later. He put his hand on my shoulder the way men do when they want something but don't want to ask for it directly. "Hadley," he said, "your grandmother left you something. Just one thing. Your stepmother and I would prefer if you took it and didn't make a scene." "What is it?" "It's at the house. We boxed it up already." I drove out to the family house that evening. Not Grandma Rosalind's bungalow, the big house, the one my father had moved into after marrying my stepmother. I had grown up in a different house, a smaller one across town, the one my mother had decorated with hand-painted tiles in the kitchen. That house had been sold the summer after my mother's funeral. I hadn't been allowed to keep the tiles. My stepmother was in the living room arranging some new flower arrangement. She didn't look up when I came in. She gestured at a cardboard box sitting on the foyer floor, the kind movers use, water-stained on one corner. "That's it," she said. "Take it and go. And Hadley, don't bother coming back for Thanksgiving. We're going to Aspen." Tobias was at the kitchen island eating leftover funeral catering off a paper plate. He smirked at me with his mouth full. "Junk," he said, nodding at the box. "Old lady saved every coupon she ever clipped. You'll love it." I knelt down and opened the flaps. Inside was a stack of yellowed envelopes, a half-finished crochet blanket in mustard yellow, a tin of butter cookies I knew was actually full of sewing notions, and at the very bottom, a wooden recipe box, hand-painted, sunflowers along the edges. My grandmother had made it in a community college woodworking class the year my mother got sick. I lifted it out and held it against my chest. "Sentimental garbage," my stepmother said, still arranging the flowers. "Get that thing out of my sight before I throw it in the trash myself. I cannot stand looking at her things anymore." I stood up slowly. I didn't say anything. I just picked up the whole box. Recipe box, blanket, cookie tin, envelopes, and walked out the front door. I drove to my apartment in Greensboro with the recipe box on the passenger seat. I'd lived alone in that apartment for 6 years, ever since I'd finished my master's in library science and gotten a job cataloging manuscripts at the university. It wasn't fancy. Hardwood floors that creaked, a kitchen with one good burner, a bay window where I kept a sad-looking pothos. But it was mine, and nobody in it ever told me to get out of their sight. I put the recipe box on the kitchen table and made myself a cup of tea. I didn't open it right away. I sat with it for a long time, the way you sit with someone you used to know. My grandmother had been the only adult in my life who treated me like I was a real person. After my mother died when I was 11, she had driven down from Asheville every other weekend for 3 years to make sure I ate something that wasn't microwaved. She had taught me how to read a contract. She had taught me how to balance a checkbook at 13. She had taught me that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who's been paying the closest attention. She had also, I remembered with a strange small flutter in my chest, taught me chess. Not the rules. Anyone could learn the rules. She'd taught me how to wait. You don't win chess by attacking, she used to say. You win it by being patient while the other person makes mistakes. I opened the recipe box. Inside were index cards, hundreds of them. Some in her handwriting, some in my great-grandmother's. Banana bread, buttermilk biscuits, Brunswick stew, a whole section on pickling. I flipped through them slowly, smelling the faint cedar of the wood, and I was so focused on not crying that I almost missed it, about 2/3 of the way through the box, between a card for chess pie, of all things. She would have laughed, and one for chicken and dumplings. There was a card that was thicker than the others, almost stiff. I pulled it out. It wasn't a recipe card. It was a folded piece of cream-colored paper taped to a piece of cardstock. I unfolded it. It was a deed, not a copy. The original. Warranty. Deed, Buncombe County, North Carolina. For the bungalow on Sycamore Street. The one my stepmother was, as of this past Monday, in the middle of selling, and the name on the deed wasn't my grandmother's. It was mine. I sat there for a long time staring at it. My own name. Full middle name and all. Hadley Eugenia Whitaker, typed on a deed that had been filed with the county on March 14th of last year. 15 months ago, 3 months before my grandmother's first stroke. 2 months before she'd had me come up to Asheville for what she'd called just a quiet weekend, sweetheart. I remembered that weekend. She had asked me to drive her to her lawyer's office because she said she didn't trust herself with parallel parking anymore. I'd sat in the waiting room reading a New Yorker for 40 minutes. When she came out, she had hugged me and said, "Everything's settled now, darling. Don't worry about a thing." I had thought she meant her will. I had not thought she meant the house. I flicked over the cardstock the deed was taped to. There was a handwritten note on the back. Her handwriting shaky but clear. "Hadley, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and your father's wife is probably trying to sell the bungalow. She can't. It isn't hers and it isn't your father's. It's yours. Has been for over a year. I told no one. I didn't trust them not to pressure me into changing it back. Top to Margaret Halliday at Halliday and Tomlin on Patton Avenue. She has the rest of what you need. I love you, and I'm sorry I had to do it this way. You deserved better from all of us." Grandma, I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time. Then I got up and walked to my bay window and stood there for a very long time looking out at the parking lot, watching a man across the way unload groceries from his trunk. He dropped a bag and oranges rolled everywhere and he laughed at himself. And I thought, that's a person whose life is one specific thing right now. Oranges. Mine just became something else entirely. The next morning I called in sick to work. I'd been there 6 years, and I'd used 4 sick days total. They didn't ask questions. I drove to Asheville. 3.5 hours up the mountain, through the gorge, the trees just starting to turn. I called Margaret Halliday from a rest stop near Hickory, and she said she'd been expecting my call for about 8 months. "Your grandmother set everything up very carefully," she told me. Her voice was the kind of calm that comes from 40 years of practice. "I'd rather not discuss it on the phone. Can you come by this afternoon?" I sat in her office at 2:30. Margaret was maybe 65. Gray bob, reading glasses on a beaded chain, a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Lawyer." She slid a folder across the desk. "Your grandmother transferred the deed to you in March of last year," she said. "Recorded with the county. Notarized. Completely valid. She also set up a small trust, about $42,000, to handle property taxes and maintenance for the next 10 years. That's also in your name. My stepmother is trying to sell it." "Yes," Margaret said. She took her glasses off and set them on the desk. "I had a feeling that was coming. Your father's wife filed paperwork with a different title company in Charlotte 3 weeks ago, before your grandmother had even passed. I felt something cold travel down my spine." "She filed before Grandma died?" "She filed the day after your grandmother went into hospice." I had to put my hand flat on the desk for a second. "Hadley," Margaret said gently, "I want you to understand what's happening here. The deed in your name is the only valid deed for that property. Anything your stepmother has filed is fraudulent. The question isn't whether she can sell the house. She can't. The question is whether she knows that, and how far she's willing to go." "What do you mean, how far?" Margaret picked up her glasses again. She didn't put them on. She just held them. "There's a man named Russell Pettyjohn who's been listed as the buyer," she said. "He's a small developer out of Charlotte. He thinks he's purchasing the property for $390,000 cash. The closing is scheduled for next Tuesday. If that closing happens, your stepmother and your father walk away with $390,000 they have no legal right to. The buyer loses his money when the title comes back fraudulent, and your stepmother and father have committed federal wire fraud because the funds are being moved across state lines." I sat there with my mouth slightly open. "I would like," Margaret said carefully, "to ask you a very serious question, and I want you to take your time answering it. Okay? Do you want to stop this before it happens, or do you want to let it happen and then call the people who handle that kind of thing?" I thought about my stepmother saying, "Get that thing out of my sight." I thought about my father, who hadn't fought for me once in 20 years. I thought about Tobias smirking with funeral catering in his mouth. I thought about my grandmother in the waiting room, slipping a deed into a recipe box because she didn't trust anyone but me. "How long do I have to decide?" "Until Monday morning," Margaret said. "After that, the closing is in motion and there's no clean way to stop it without action." I drove out to the bungalow on Sycamore Street that night. My grandmother had given me a key years ago, and I'd never given it back. The house was exactly the way I remembered it. Green shutters, gardenia bushes by the porch, the wind chimes she'd made from old spoons. Inside, it smelled like her, lemon furniture polish in the cedar closet in the hall. I sat on her couch in the dark for a long time. Then I called Margaret back. "I want to do it the second way," I said. There was a pause on the line. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. It will mean letting them try. It will mean watching them sign documents that will send them to federal prison. It will mean your father, too." "I know. It will be hard, Hadley." "It will be exactly," I said, and my voice did not shake, "what my grandmother saw coming." That night I drove back to Greensboro, and I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the recipe box, and I read every card my grandmother had ever written. There was a card in the back labeled Hadley, age 8, first time making biscuits. She had written down every mistake I'd made, lovingly, like a research log. Too much buttermilk, forgot to chill the butter, cut them too thin. They were still delicious because she made them. I cried a little. Not a lot, just enough. On Friday morning I called my stepmother. "Hi," I said. I made my voice sound small. I made it sound the way she liked it. I wanted to apologize for not staying longer the other day. I know things have been hard for you too. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Hadley, I really don't have time for this. I wanted to say, the box, the stuff in the box, I went through it and I think you were right. It's mostly junk. I'm going to donate the blanket. But I wondered, is there anything from her house you wanted? Before the sale, I know she had some good silver. I could pick something out for you." There was a pause. I could practically hear her recalibrating. "That's actually very thoughtful of you, Hadley. I just want us to be okay." "Well," her voice warmed about 2 degrees. "If you're going up to Asheville anyway," the dining set, the mahogany one. I've always loved that piece. "Of course, and Hadley, the closing is Tuesday. Your father and I would appreciate it if you weren't there. It would just be awkward. The buyer is a very particular man." "I understand. Good girl." I hung up and I sat very still for a minute. I had not been called good girl by a woman in 20 years. The last woman who had called me that had been my mother, the night before she went into the hospital for the last time. My stepmother had used it like a slap. I called Margaret. I told her everything my stepmother had just told me. She said she'd contact the buyer's title company quietly on Monday and confirm the closing schedule. She also said she had a contact at the FBI's Charlotte field office, a woman named Audra Eccleston, white-collar crime, who would want to know. I asked her if I could be there when it happened. She said, "You can be in the building." The closing was scheduled for 10 a.m. Tuesday at a title company in Charlotte. My stepmother had insisted on Charlotte because she said the title companies in Asheville were slow. They weren't slow. They would have caught her in 20 minutes. My father had agreed to it because my father agreed to everything she said no. I drove down on Monday night and stayed at a Hampton Inn off I-77. Margaret met me there at 8 a.m. Tuesday in the lobby with 2 coffees. She handed me one. Agent Eccleston and her partner are already at the title office, she said. They've briefed the title company's compliance officer. The closing will proceed as scheduled. The buyer is not in on this. He's a genuine victim. He'll get his money back, every dollar, because the wire transfer will be reversed before it clears. What about my father? She looks at me for a long second. Hadley, are you sure? He chose her, I said. Every single time he had a choice, he chose her. I am not the one who put him in that room. He put himself in that room. She nodded once. We drove to the title office. We didn't go inside. We sat in Margaret's Lexus in the parking lot across the street, drinking coffee, watching the front door. At 9:48, my stepmother and father pulled up in his Lexus. She was wearing a cream-colored suit in pearls. He was wearing the navy blazer my mother had bought him for his 40th birthday. He'd kept the blazer. Not the wife. The blazer. They walked in together. Russell Pettyjohn, a stocky man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, pulled up 3 minutes later in a Tahoe. He carried a leather portfolio. At 10:06 a.m., a black SUV pulled up to the front of the building. 2 people got out, a woman in a navy suit and a man in a gray one. They didn't hurry. They walked into the building the way people walk into a place they have every right to be in. At 10:24, a second car pulled up. 2 uniformed officers from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg PD got out and went inside. At 10:41, the front door of the title office opened. My stepmother came out first. She was handcuffed. She was screaming. I could hear her from across the street through the closed windows of Margaret's Lexus. She was screaming that this was a mistake, that she was a doctor's wife. She wasn't. My father was a retired insurance underwriter. That she would be calling her attorney. That this was harassment. That she had never in her life. And then they put her in the back of the squad car and closed the door and you couldn't hear her anymore. My father came out next. He wasn't screaming. He was just walking. His shoulders looked very small inside the navy blazer. He didn't fight the handcuffs. The female agent had her hand on his elbow gently. He looked old. Older than he was. He looked for one moment as they walked him to the second car, directly across the street at where Margaret and I were sitting. I don't think he could see us through the tinted windows, but I think he knew I was somewhere nearby. He had the look of a man who had finally understood what had been happening for a very long time, and had no one left to blame for it but himself. He didn't fight when they put him in the car. I watched until both cars pulled away. Then I cried for a while, not for my stepmother, for my father, because he had been my dad before he had been her husband, and somewhere underneath everything I still remembered that, and grief is a complicated thing that does not give you permission to feel only one feeling at a time. Margaret handed me a tissue from a packet in her glove compartment. She let me cry. She didn't say anything stupid. When I was done, she said, "Tobias, he wasn't on the deed. He wasn't a signatory. He benefited. He didn't break the law." "No," she said, "but the IRS is going to be very interested in some Venmo transactions between him and his mother over the last 6 months. That's not my department." But I made a call. I almost laughed. The next 3 weeks were a blur. There were depositions, there were affidavits, there was a journalist from the Charlotte Observer who tried to get me to comment and I politely declined. My stepmother was charged with wire fraud, attempted real estate fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. My father was charged as a co-conspirator. Both of them entered pleas. My father's lawyer told mine off the record that my father wanted me to know he was sorry. I didn't write back. Not yet. Maybe someday. Not yet. Tobias got audited. He had reported about a quarter of his actual income for the past 3 years. He was not arrested, but he was levied for back taxes and penalties that, last I heard, came to about $170,000. He had to sell his BMW. I heard this from a cousin who heard it from another cousin. I did not feel happy about it. I did not feel sad about it. I felt like a person watching weather happen. Russell Pettyjohn, the developer, got his money back within 48 hours. Just like Margaret had said, he wrote me a letter, actually. A real letter, handwritten on yellow legal pad paper, apologizing for his unwitting role and thanking me for preventing a real bad situation from getting worse. He said his daughter was about my age and that he hoped I had people around me. I framed that letter. It hangs in my kitchen now, next to the deed. I quit the cataloging job in November. I moved to Asheville the week before Thanksgiving. I live in the bungalow on Sycamore Street now. I painted the kitchen the same yellow my grandmother had it in 1987. I planted sunflowers along the chain-link fence. They came up beautiful this past summer, messy and crooked and full of bees. I work from home now, doing manuscript appraisals for 3 different rare book dealers up and down the East Coast. I make less money than I did at the university. I am happier than I have ever been. The recipe box sits on the kitchen counter where I can see it from the sink. I have added cards to it. I write down my own recipes now, in pencil, the way my grandmother did. I have a card for buttermilk biscuits that says, in my own handwriting, "Too much buttermilk again. Still good." She would have laughed. People ask me sometimes if I regret how it went. If I wish I had warned my father. If I wish I had pulled the deed out at the funeral and stopped the whole thing before it started. I think about that a lot. And here's what I have come to understand. My grandmother could have given me the deed in person. She could have sat me down at her kitchen table and said, "Sweetheart, I'm giving you the house. Here are the papers. Don't tell anyone." She didn't. She hid it in the recipe box and she let me find it after everything had already started moving. She did that on purpose. She did that because she had been watching my family for 40 years and she knew that the only way I would ever be free of them was to let them choose, in front of witnesses, exactly what kind of people they were. She didn't trap them. She gave them every chance in the world to be decent. They were not decent. That wasn't my fault. It wasn't her fault either. That was just who they were. And she loved me enough to make sure that when the truth finally arrived, it arrived in my hands, in a box that smelled like cedar and lemon polish and a woman who had taught me how to wait. I don't argue with people anymore. I don't try to convince anyone of anything. I don't explain myself to family members who never wanted to hear it. I just open the box, I read the cards, I make the biscuits, and I let the rest of the world be exactly as loud as it wants to be, because I have learned what my grandmother knew, what my mother probably would have taught me if she'd lived long enough to do it. The quietest person in the room is usually the one who's been paying the closest attention. And sometimes, if you've been paying close enough attention for long enough, you don't have to say a single word. You just have to be ready when the moment comes. I was ready. She knew I would be. People ask me sometimes how I knew to wait. They look at me across coffee tables and book signings and the kitchen island in the bungalow on Sycamore Street, and they ask it the way people ask about magic tricks. Like I had some secret nobody else had access to. I didn't. What I had was a grandmother who paid attention. What I had was 11 years of being the quiet kid in a house where loud people got everything they wanted, and I learned, the way kids learn things they shouldn't have to learn, that being quiet wasn't the same as being weak. It was just a different kind of strength, the kind that waits. My stepmother spent 20 years of her life building something she thought was a fortress. A husband who agreed with her, a son who copied her, a house full of expensive things, and a calendar full of trips to places that didn't matter. She thought she was winning. She thought I was losing. And the thing is, she wasn't entirely wrong about either of us for a very long time. I really was losing. I lost my mother, I lost my father in slow motion, I lost my father in slow motion, I lost my place at the table, I lost 20 Thanksgivings. I'll never get back, but here is what I think nobody tells you about losing things. Sometimes losing teaches you what to hold on to. Grandma Rosalind held on to me. She held on to me when nobody else in that family thought I was worth the trouble. And in the end, she didn't give me a house. She gave me proof that someone had been paying attention to my life the whole time. The house was just the paperwork. I think about cause and effect a lot now. My stepmother chose every day for 2 decades to be cruel in small ways. Tobias chose every day to copy her. My father chose every day to look the other way. Nobody made them do any of that. They built the lives they got. The handcuffs in that parking lot in Charlotte weren't bad luck. They were the bill coming due for 1,000 small decisions made on 1,000 ordinary mornings by people who thought nobody was keeping score. But someone was. Grandma Rosalind was. And then, eventually, I was. What I want to say to anyone who feels invisible in their own family, anyone who has been told their grief is inconvenient or their love is sentimental garbage, is this. Your character is being built right now, in the small hours, in the rooms where nobody is watching. Be honest in those rooms. Be patient in those rooms. Learn things in those rooms, how money works, how laws work, how people actually behave when they think no one is looking. Knowledge is not revenge. Knowledge is just refusing to be lied to anymore. The biscuits taste better when you've waited for the butter to chill. Grandma told me that when I was 8, I thought she was talking about biscuits. She wasn't.